The email arrived on a Tuesday, a ghost in the machine that would come to define my final days. It was from a producer I'd never heard of, MS. Albright, and the subject line was clinical, cold, project continuation, the Echo Man. I was a freelance video editor. My world was a small, dark basement room that I called my suite. It was a sanctuary of controlled timelines, of stories I could manipulate, cut, and color to my will. I preferred the company of glowing pixels to people, and the solitude was a comfort. This job, however, felt different from the start. The pay was substantial, enough to make me ignore the knot of unease tightening in my stomach. The project was a true crime documentary about a local urban legend known as the Echo Man, a figure said to exist only in reflections in the periphery. The original director, a man named David Chun, had disappeared a few months prior. Vanished, left behind a mountain of hard drives and a half-finished project. My job was to take his raw, chaotic footage and sculpt it into a coherent narrative. MS. Albright had assured me it was a straightforward salvage operation. She'd explained that David had become obsessed, erratic, before he went missing. She told me to just focus on the material. The first few days were a methodical ritual. I ingested terabytes of footage, logging clips, arranging bins, building my digital workspace. The content was what you'd expect. Shaky b-roll of desolate, forgotten places, rotting hospitals, overgrown cemeteries, abandoned industrial parks. There were dozens of interviews with so-called witnesses, their faces washed out under harsh lighting, their voices a low murmur of local folklore and half-remembered ghost stories. It was all standard fare for the genre. Unsettling? Sure, but it was a manufactured dread. It was a story on a screen, and I was the one in control. I was the editor. I held all the power. The incident that began the unraveling happened late one night, about a week into the project. I was working on the first key interview, a sequence with an elderly librarian. She spoke in a frail, whispery voice about seeing the Echo Man's reflection in the polished surface of a heavy oak table in the library's archives. Her story was compelling, her fear seemingly genuine. To check the shot's focus, I zoomed in, pushing the frame tighter and tighter on her face until her eye filled my monitor. It was a shot I'd done 1,000 times. But this time was different. There, in the tiny, convex universe of her cornea, was a reflection. It wasn't the clear image of David Chun and his camera. It was something else. A shape, a tall, impossibly thin figure, standing just behind where David must have been. It was indistinct, blurred by the curve of her eye, a smudge of darkness in the light. I blinked, leaning back. It had to be a digital artifact, a compression glitch from the old camera he'd used. I played the clip back, frame by frame. The smudge was there for only a few frames, a flicker of wrongness that was gone as quickly as it appeared. I scrubbed back and forth over it. The figure was utterly still, a silent, unmoving observer. A cold draft, seemingly from nowhere, snaked its way around my ankles. I shook my head, dismissing it. The late hours and the grim subject matter were getting to me. I made a note on the clip, possible artifacting, and moved on. But the image of that dark shape was burned onto the back of my eyelids. I couldn't unsee it. The feeling of being watched started subtly. It was a prickling on my neck, the kind that makes you turn around expecting to see someone standing there. But my basement was always empty. The only company I had was the hum of my computer and the low drone of the hard drives, spinning with David Chen's last moments. I tried to bury myself in the work, to lose myself in the rhythm of the edit. I started assembling a sequence from an interview with a former night watchman at an abandoned medical facility. He was a nervous, twitchy man, and he described seeing things on the banks of dead security monitors late at night. He claimed a silhouette would sometimes appear on a screen, even when the cameras were off. To build tension, I started cutting in David's B-roll footage of that same security office. The room was thick with dust, the dozen or so monitors arranged in a silent, dead chorus. As I scrubbed through a slow pan across the bank of screens, I saw it again. A flicker. I stopped the playback, my hand freezing on the mouse. On the dark, dusty glass of one of the monitors, there was a reflection. It was the same tall, thin silhouette from the librarian's eye, but this time it was clearer, more defined, still out of focus, as if standing in a thick fog just beyond the veil of our world, but unmistakably a figure. I could almost make out the suggestion of long limbs, of a head tilted at an unnatural angle. My blood ran cold. This was no glitch. This was in the footage. David had filmed it. Had he seen it? Or was it something that only revealed itself later, in the playback? A ghost in the machine. A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain, I isolated the audio track for that specific B-roll clip. On the surface, it was just room tone, the faint hum of old wiring, the distant sound of wind rattling a window frame. But I had a feeling. I dragged the audio into my sound editor, applied a series of filters, and amplified the gain until the waveform was a jagged mountain range. And then I heard it. Beneath the hiss and static, a sound emerged. It was a whisper, rhythmic and low, like dry leaves scraping across concrete. It was distorted, as if spoken through water, but it was there. It was a single word, repeated over and over, an unintelligible, guttural loop. I listened to it again and again, my headphones clamped over my ears, trying to decipher it. The word was alien, ancient, but the intent was clear. It was a summoning, a calling. I ripped the headphones off, my heart pounding against my ribs. The silence of my basement was suddenly deafening, heavy. I felt a pressure in the air, a change in the very atmosphere of the room. I saved the project and shut down the computer for the night. But the whisper followed me into my dreams, a distorted, static-filled lullaby. Sleep offered no escape. I was haunted by long, dark hallways and the feeling of being pursued by something I could never quite see. I started working longer hours, fueled by caffeine and a growing obsession. The documentary was no longer just a job. It was a puzzle I had to solve. What had happened to David Chun? What was this thing he had captured on camera? I became a digital archaeologist, sifting through the bones of his project, looking for answers. A few days later, I was deep into the edit of a particularly disturbing sequence. It was raw, handheld footage from David's camera, a first-person exploration of an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. The only light was the weak beam of his flashlight, cutting through the oppressive darkness. The only sound was his ragged breathing and the crunch of broken glass under his boots. He was walking down a long, decaying corridor lined with peeling paint and the ghosts of forgotten lives. At the very end of the hall was a window, its glass grimy and streaked with years of filth. As David's camera approached it, I saw the reflection in the glass. The figure was there, but this time it wasn't static. It was moving. Its head was tilted, tracking David's approach with a slow, deliberate motion. It was no longer just an observer. It was interacting. I felt a jolt of pure, undiluted terror. It was as if the thing was becoming aware of the camera, aware of being watched. I glanced at the time code on the clip. It read 3 hours, 33 minutes, and 14 seconds. As my eyes registered the numbers, an intense, unnatural cold flooded my basement suite. It was a deep, penetrating cold that sank into my bones, making my teeth chatter. The air grew thick, heavy, smelling of damp earth and ozone. I pushed my chair back, my gaze darting around the dark corners of my room. It was empty as always, but the feeling was undeniable. I was not alone. My eyes fell on my secondary monitor, which I kept turned off to save power. Its screen was a polished black mirror. For one terrifying, heart-stopping second, I saw it. A tall, dark shape standing behind my own reflection. I spun around in my chair, so fast I nearly fell over. Nothing, just the concrete wall and the neatly organized shelves of my workspace. But the image was seared into my mind. The cold in the room lingered, a physical presence. My eyes were drawn to my webcam, perched atop my main monitor. Its tiny green indicator light was on. It was watching me. I never used it. I never plugged it in unless I had a client call, and I hadn't had one in weeks. With a hand that trembled violently, I reached behind the monitor and ripped the USB cable out of its port. The green light stayed on for a second longer, a defiant emerald eye, before finally winking out. The cold in the room slowly began to recede, but the fear remained, a permanent resident in my soul. The project consumed me. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. My life narrowed to the glowing rectangle of the screen and the hunt for the figure in the reflections. I ignored the increasingly frequent emails from MS Albright, who was now demanding to see a rough cut. I couldn't explain to her what was happening. How could I? That the project was haunted? That the footage was alive? She would think I was insane. Maybe I was. I became an expert at finding it. I learned to look for the subtle distortions, the flickers of movement where there should be none. I found a figure everywhere. In a murky puddle on a rain-slick street. In the warped chrome of a car's hubcap as it drove by. In the tiny polished surface of a silver locket worn by one of the interviewees. It was always there, a phantom hitchhiker in David's digital world. And I began to notice a terrifying pattern. I started arranging the clips on my timeline chronologically, based on the metadata from David's camera. In the earliest footage, the footage shot months before he disappeared, the figure was distant, almost imperceptible. A smudge in the background. But as I moved forward in time, through the weeks and days leading up to his vanishing, the figure grew closer, sharper, more present. In one of the last clips he ever shot, an interview with a historian at a local diner, I found the most chilling image yet. As the historian stirred his coffee, I zoomed in on the reflection in the back of the small silver spoon. There, warped and distorted, was the Echo Man. It was no longer standing in the background. It was standing directly behind David Chen's shoulder. Its form was still hazy, but the proximity was suffocating. I could almost feel its presence in my own room, a cold breath on the back of my neck. That's when the project files began to fight back. Timelines would become corrupted overnight. Edits I'd spent hours on would be undone. Audio clips would play in reverse, their garbled speech hiding new, terrifying whispers. I started hearing my own name, a distorted, static-laced version of it, buried deep within the noise. The barrier between me and the footage was dissolving. I was no longer just an observer, an editor putting together a story. I was becoming part of it. The footage wasn't just a record of David's investigation. It felt like a trap, and it was slowly closing around me. My search for answers led me to a hidden partition on one of the main project drives. It was password protected. I spent an entire day running decryption software, trying to brute force my way in, with no success. Defeated, I slumped back in my chair, staring at the password prompt. What would an obsessed man use as a password? Something personal? A date? Or something related to his obsession? My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed a single word, Echo. Access granted. The partition contained only one folder, and inside that folder, a single video file. It was named Final. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was the answer. I double-clicked the file. It opened in my media player, and the image that filled the screen stole the air from my lungs. It was footage of an editing suite. My editing suite. But it wasn't me in the chair. It was David Chen. He looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide with a terror that I now knew intimately. He was staring at his monitors with the same desperate intensity that I had been for weeks. I checked the timestamp burned into the corner of the video. It was from the day before he was officially reported missing. This was his last testament. I watched, mesmerized, as the David on my screen began to speak frantically to his webcam, the very same one I had unplugged. But the video file had no audio track. It was utterly silent, a pantomime of fear. He gesticulated wildly, his hands shaking. He kept pointing at something behind him, something off camera. I leaned closer to my monitor, my face inches from the screen, trying to understand. I watched the reflection on David's monitor in the footage, and I saw it, the figure, standing in the room right behind David Chen. It was no longer a blurry silhouette or a hazy smudge. It was in focus. It was horrifyingly real. It was tall and emaciated, its limbs too long, its joints bending at angles that were deeply, fundamentally wrong. It wore what looked like a tattered black suit, but its most terrifying feature was its face. It had no eyes, no nose, no mouth. It was a smooth, pale, featureless expanse of skin, like a mannequin that had been worn down by time. As I watched, paralyzed, the creature in the footage slowly raised one of its long, skeletal hands and placed it on David's shoulder. David flinched violently in the silent video, his whole body seizing up. And then he began to fade. He became translucent, the chair behind him visible through his body. Within seconds, he was gone, simply edited out of existence. The chair was empty. The creature in the reflection, the Echo Man, then did something that broke my mind. It turned its blank, horrifying face away from the empty chair and looked directly out of the reflection on David's monitor. It looked at the webcam that was recording the footage. It looked directly at me. I screamed, throwing myself backwards, my chair slamming into the wall. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes locked on the screen, on the footage of the now empty editing suite. But it wasn't empty anymore. Something had changed on David's desktop in the video. A new file had just appeared. A blank document icon. Its name was a single word, Alex. My blood turned to ice. At that exact moment, on my own desktop, outside of the video player, a new file blinked into existence. It had the same icon, the same name. Alex. My gaze shot to the webcam I had unplugged. Its green light flickered on. A deep, profound, grave-robbing cold filled the room, more intense than ever before. My breath plumed in the air. Slowly, with a dread that was absolute, I turned my head to look at the polished black screen of my powered-off secondary monitor. In its dark mirror, I saw my own face, pale and frozen in terror. And standing right behind me, I saw him. The tall, gaunt figure. The smooth, blank face. Its long, skeletal hand was reaching for my shoulder. The red recording light on my main monitor blinked on. The sound of a final, distorted whisper filled my ears, the last thing I would ever edit. The Echo Man doesn't just want to be seen. He wants a new director. Was I just another piece of footage in a collection that never ends? Maybe, unless you're brave enough to find out what happens next in the story of the broadcast that never aired.